going to be talking about the question, tell me about yourself. And it doesn't really sound like a question, but it actually is a question because you're encouraging the other person to share information. So sometimes you don't actually have to have a question in order for you to be seeking information from the other person. It's a little more of a command, but it's encouraging the other person to share information. And so let's talk a little bit about this conversation question. Tell me about yourself. Now, this question is incredibly common when you are in professional situations. This is a question that is often asked in job interviews and also other types of interviews, like whether they're volunteer positions or academic situations. People generally start with this question, tell me about yourself. And the reason we start with this question is it really encourages the other person to give you their story, to share what it is that is important to them, to tell you kind of the summary of the reason why you're interacting in this situation. So we're going to start looking at this from more of a professional standpoint, and then we're going to talk about how it can also be used in personal situations. I feel like it's less common that we ask this question in personal situations, but it could be in a more networking event, a mixer, happy hour, where you're interacting with professionals, where you're interacting with people that you don't really know, maybe some sort of social event or gala for a nonprofit. You're likely to kind of give somebody that opportunity to tell you a little bit about themselves. So this is a very simple question. It's a simple statement. Tell me about yourself. It's an encouraging way to start talking to another person. And in a job interview, this is basically your invitation to start sharing what's most important about your job history. The thing I want you to understand is that the way you start responding to this question really is your first impression for the person. So it can feel a little intimidating because you may feel like you aren't really sure, like how can I express myself perfectly? You don't have to worry about expressing yourself perfectly with this first impression. You just have to keep the conversation open. So you have to give enough information that you can start that give and take, that conversations back and forth. So that's why I want you to really think about how you would respond to this question. So as we go through this lesson, I want to really hear from you guys how you would start responding to this question, and we can workshop it. We can work on it together in order to find a stronger answer. I mentioned in the last episode on what do you do that I think that's a lazy question, and tell me about yourself can be a little bit lazy, but I view it more as an invitation because the person can respond however they want. And so we're going to talk about how to respond to this question in job interview settings, but we're also going to evolve this question, how you can talk about yourself beyond your professional situation or beyond your academic situation, because I know not everybody works. Sometimes you're between jobs, maybe you're an artist. There's a lot of different reasons where you might not want to just talk about your job history, and we're going to talk about that too. Now, this question is really also an invitation for you to share what's most important, because if you think about your resume, and I know in other countries you call it a CV, but we call it a resume. If you look at your resume and you just start listing off your work experience, that's really not what's essential in American culture. And this is something I really want you guys to understand whenever we talk about professional questions. In the United States, we're more interested in what you know how to do, not really where you worked or what your job title was and how you do it. There are some professions where job title in your employment history is more important, but because of the nature of the world and how there's more entrepreneurship, people are starting to gain experience through internships, volunteering, and so on, people really aren't that interested in your job title. And that's why with episode 1, I explained to you that I'm not really interested in what do you do as your job title, because you aren't your job title. You have more history, more information, more stories about yourself. So I really want you guys to understand that in American culture, it's more important what can you do? What do you know how to do? What are you passionate about? What's your experience, not your work experience like your resume, but what's your experience with the world, with other people? So when someone asks you, tell me about yourself, you're able to answer that in any way you really choose. And this is your chance to kind of summarize your story. This is really important to understand when you're thinking about how to, kind of tie different parts of your experience together. If I were to just talk about my resume and go through all my years of experience, it might seem a little confusing. I've worked in California, in Providence, Rhode Island, in Boston, in Peru, and in Chile in the last 10 years. So people might look at my job history and say like, "Wow, what's your story? Like why are you going through all these jobs?" So when I have the opportunity to tell somebody about myself, I'm able to connect the dots and provide that kind of connection between the topics so that the person is able to really understand what it is that moves me, what it is that motivates me, what it is that inspires me. So yeah, and so my experience has shown when I work on interview skills with my clients and I work on job interviews, a lot of times when we start practicing this question, people just go through what we call a laundry list, the details from their resume, and they say, well, first I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. That's kind of boring, right? It's like a list, right? And that's why we say laundry list, like things you have to do. Check, check, check. Instead, I want to encourage you to really think about how you can ask people, how you can share information about your story and how it connects together. Like to think of yourself as a storyteller of your own personal story. Tell me about yourself is an opportunity to share anything you want, because maybe currently you're studying one thing, but you want to transition into another job, or you've worked in this job, but you did something else because you needed to pay the bills. So I want you to think about that. And yeah, this question. And so, yeah, so like I said, non-native speakers often tell people their kind of laundry list of their job story, because it's more common in other cultures that you need a certain job title in order to get jobs. In the United States, it's evolved in the last 20 or 30 years and things have changed. So people are more interested in your experience and not exactly what you did, exactly where, exactly what company. So I want you to really think about that as we talk about this. And I also want you to think about that when you come into the conversation with other person, you need to really think about your clear idea of what you want the other person to know about you. So what you want them to understand about you. So that's, as we go through this live lesson, I want you to think about if you were to meet me and we were going to have some tea, which I'll be talking about in a moment. If we were to sit down and have tea or coffee, what would you want me to know about you first? And that's what you want to start with. You have to think about the situation. If you're at a job interview, you want to highlight the things that are most relevant to the job you're interviewing for. If you're at a networking event, maybe you're looking for some collaboration or colleagues in order to work together. Maybe you need some funding for your project, for your entrepreneurial project. If you're in some sort of social setting, maybe you want to make new friends, or you want to find people who are interested in your hobbies like hiking or biking or watercolor art or woodworking, whatever it is that you do. So you want to think about what's your goal for this interaction with the other person, and then you're going to choose how to respond based on that. So I always tell my clients, you want to start knowing exactly what it is you are going, what's your goal, right? What's your motivation? What's your intention for this interaction with the other person? And then you're going to choose your response based on that. So it's like we said last time, how do you want other people to feel about you after your interaction? When someone asks you, tell me about yourself, it's an opportunity to say whatever it is you want. And that's another thing to just keep in mind with these types of conversation questions. I had somebody email me and ask me if the language I teach is for business English. And I want you guys to understand that all of these communication skills are appropriate both in personal and professional situations. There are times you're going to use more formal language, you're going to be a little more polite, less direct in formal professional settings, but it really is important for you to understand that this language is language for life, right? There are going to be times you need to negotiate with your boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, your friends, right? And you're going to need this language. There's going to be reasons that you agree with somebody or disagree, and you're going to have to find a nice way to say that. So I want you to understand that even though I'm not calling this business English, it's professional language. And even though maybe we'll talk about job interviews more in this particular lesson, these the ability to talk about these is going to be helpful for you in personal situations when you're interacting with strangers. And I was doing a little research for today, and I found, somebody who said that this was a great question to ask in a social situation. Tell me about yourself, or tell me about you. So I want you to think about that. A similar related question to tell me about yourself is also what's your story? Like, people will just start talking, what's your story? And we'll talk about asking this question a little bit later. So I hope as you have any questions, please respond to me. So today I really do want you to tell me about yourself. Remember, in this series, the people who show up live are able to get feedback as we go through. So if somebody asks you, tell me about yourself, just like I've described, how would you start telling the person about yourself? So tell me a little bit about yourself. And I know it's going to take a moment to type into the chat box, but I encourage you to tell me a little bit about yourself. So think about your story. How do you want to introduce yourself to me, right? Because I don't know that much about you. I recognize your name and your avatar from YouTube, but tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me, you can tell me where you're from if that's important, your city. Maybe you live in the United States or another English-speaking country, or you plan to move there. Tell me about, what's your work, or what's your passion outside of work? Maybe your studies, maybe both. And that's something we'll talk about later, that you may have, you may be working in one thing, but you may need to study another thing. So I'd like to get to know you guys through this live lesson. So I encourage you to tell me about yourself as I tell you about myself as we go through the lesson. So please be sure to give me some comments and let me know. Tell me about yourself. It needs to be participation, right? That's the teacher in me. Okay. So like I was saying earlier in the lesson, when someone asks you, tell me about yourself, this is your opportunity to highlight what's most important to you about this job, about the situation you're hoping to get into, and about other things like that. So this is your opportunity. So it's your opportunity to shine, as we say, right? So think about how you're going to tell somebody about yourself. What do you want them to know? So in a job interview, like I said, you want to come in with a clear idea of what you want the other person to know. What's the goal of your conversation? And I also mentioned that you may need to connect the dots of your story if it's not entirely clear from your, one paper, your resume, which might be 1 or 2 pages maximum. That's like your whole life on a piece of paper, right? So how would you clarify your job history in a job interview? How would you help the person understand why you studied one thing, but maybe you changed into another thing? For example, I've mentioned in previous videos that for my bachelor's degree, I studied comparative literature and Spanish language and literature. That's why I speak Spanish fluently at a high level, because I studied literature, so it's a higher level of Spanish. And then when I got my master's, I studied Latin American studies, and I studied Peruvian fusion music. So if I'm going to a job interview for an English teacher, how do I connect this part of my story? It can make sense. I studied literature, I studied language, and I'll show you how I connect them, because my career has evolved since I finished my master's degree 9 years ago and started teaching. So yeah, and that's another thing. Like, for a while, even though I was teaching English, I didn't have an official teaching certificate. Now I do, but that didn't mean I wasn't talented. I got lots of jobs without having this official certificate because, like I said earlier, in the United States, it doesn't matter as much. It's what do you do? What's your story? How can you share your knowledge? So that's great. I see a couple of you guys still saying hello. So please give me a comment. I know the reason you're not responding. There's a delay and you're typing in the chat box. Okay. So let's think about how to connect the dots of your story. So if you've worked in a lot of different places, a lot of different countries like me, or if your work is still in progress, maybe you're a student, maybe you're in your early 20s and you're just getting started, or maybe you changed careers. We call that a pivot, when you change careers and you go in a different direction that's like kind of related and you go off in another direction. So think about how you can connect this thread of your story, how you can share this connection between your story. And I'll show you with my story how I do that. And the reason I call it Conversations with Kim is that I want you to kind of get to know me through my story as well, but also know how I would explain myself in a conversation. Okay. So let's say if I answer the question, someone says, tell me about yourself, and I say, I teach English online and I make YouTube videos. Could be interesting, right? Like those of you who like YouTube would be like, hey, that's cool. What's your channel? I want to follow you. But how can you answer that question a little bit better, right? If I say I teach English online, who knows? Maybe you think I'm doing tutoring on italki or another, you know, site like that, and or you don't really know the story of my English teaching. You don't know about my years of experience. You don't know about my experience training teachers. You don't know about my interest in other cultures. So instead of, if I just say what I do, even just as simply as what we talked about last week, I'm not giving you that much information, right? So I want you to think about this. So here's how I already kind of thought about it beforehand because I wanted to be prepared with how I would respond to you guys. How do I want you to think about me? Do I want you to know I teach online? Sure. Do I want you to be on my YouTube channel? Sure. I love having you guys in these live lessons. But I can say something more interesting. So, for example, if somebody says, okay, Kim, tell me about yourself. What do you want me to know about you? I would say, well, I've always been interested in connecting with people from other cultures. That's why I started studying literature, and I studied specifically comparative literature, where we studied literature from around the globe, and I really got an understanding of other cultures. That led me to study abroad in Argentina, where I really experienced, deeply understood living in another culture. And then I can kind of evolve and say, well, that's why I got my master's degree in Latin American studies, as I really wanted to understand the culture and the stories and the history of different regions of Latin America. But if I were really telling this story when I met somebody, I probably would just skip all that beginning stuff. Like I said, you don't have to read your job resume. So here's what I would probably say. So I've always been interested in connecting and learning about people from other cultures. 10 years ago, I started teaching English to refugees. And since then, my job has taken me on a wild journey. I've taught in California, in Rhode Island, in Massachusetts, also in South America, in Peru, and in Chile. I've really started to focus on my particular strength. I focus on helping non-native speakers communicate better and help them understand the natural flow of conversation. And because I know accent is so important for confidence, I really help them understand the way that they can reduce their accent and improve how they speak English. I want to help them connect with other people. So I work on skills that will help them ensure their message is clear. And that enables me to help them connect with me and connect with other people from my culture, but it also enables me to share my experiences and lead to some cultural exchange. What do you think? Is that more interesting than I teach English online? So I really want you guys to think about that. So I've really connected the dots of my story if I start talking about my bachelor's and master's degrees, but I'm connecting this story by talking about how I really have always been interested in other cultures and intercultural exchange, because I teach English not just because I love reading, I love literature, but because I actually love using language of communication. And like I say in so many videos, language is communication, right? And since English tends to be a global language, you can talk to people from all over the world, like you guys here in the live chat. So think about in a job interview, if I'm interviewing for an international nonprofit and I want to work overseas, they're going to be so interested in hearing that I've always been focused on intercultural communication, but I don't have a technical degree in intercultural communication. But my job history, you can kind of understand that I work with other cultures, but how can I connect it? How can I bring it all together? Similarly, I mentioned in the last episode that I used to work in New York and I used to work in a corporate immigration law firm. So I often mention my corporate background when I want to prove that I understand the professional environment. I understand being very serious and very official. I understand New York. I understand business, because a lot of times through my English teaching, I also am teaching business English or professional communication. So I often try to connect that at some point. You know, if I feel like the person needs to know that I know something more than just teaching English, because even though it's a great skill, people like to know that you have experience in other parts of the world. Also, my jobs in South America weren't just about teaching, right? And that's why I say I don't often mention teaching. I also have coordinated volunteers, I've led events, I've managed budgets, I've done other things. And so when somebody asks you, tell me about yourself, it's your opportunity to share those details, especially if they're relevant to the. I also mentioned that you could potentially get you can potentially be asked this question outside of a job interview. Like I said, in a networking event where you have a chance to interact with people from other cultures, you might have the opportunity to answer this question. It can be a good conversation starter for people. So think about how you would respond in different environments. Go in with your goal, as I keep repeating, and be sure you're focusing on that main idea throughout what you're speaking. Keep that main goal in line. Do you want to show how talented you are as an employee? Do you want to show how passionate you are about this field of work or study? Do you want to show how much you really are interested in using your experience in order to further your career? It really depends on you and your goals. I want to talk about this question a little bit more and how to make it better, right? So I mentioned in my last video that what do you do is a lazy question. Now I'm going to have a sip of tea. What do you do is a lazy question because it's only focused on work unless you follow it up with what do you do for work or for fun or for, for a living. You can ask more details. But tell me about yourself can seem like a lazy question too. So I want you to understand that you have to view this question as an invitation for you to share as much as you want to. So if someone asks you, tell me about yourself, they're giving you the opportunity to share what's important to you. They're letting you be in control of the conversation. That's why it's a better question. It invites the other person to share what's important to them. So if you're feeling like, or if you decide to ask this question to another person, you may find they don't respond well. And that's because not everyone's outgoing or extroverted. Okay, if you ask somebody, tell me about yourself, and you're smiling, you're happy, you're encouraging them to share, and you're not getting a response that you want, you might want to ask them a follow-up question. That means another question to get more details. So for example, when I've interviewed people for jobs, I usually do start with tell me about yourself because it's an invitation for them to lead the conversation and it'll flow from there. But I usually follow up the question, tell me about yourself, with what interests you about this job? What brings you to apply for this job? What encouraged you to be here? What's the connection between, I have your resume. What's your story? How does this job fit into your goals, right? So I usually try to give them a little guidance in order to encourage them towards answering in a way that feels more comfortable. So they don't feel like, some people get really stressed in job interviews. Wow, what are you asking me? So I usually try to follow it up with a question. But if you ask in a friendly situation, tell me about yourself. What do you love doing? What are you passionate about? What are you interested in? What inspires you? You're already following it up with a more interesting question. And in that guide I showed you, and in future videos, I will be showing you more questions like that. So for example, if somebody asks you this question, so basically you want to guide the person towards the information you want. So all of your questions as we go through this series of Conversations with Kim episodes, and as you learn how to ask conversation questions, you're thinking about the conversation you're trying to have, your conversational goal. So if you're outside the office, you might want to focus on what's most important to you. Could be your job, might be your family, your volunteer work, your studies, your hobbies. It really depends on the person. For me, I'm pretty passionate about my work here on English with Kim. I love this YouTube channel as it continues to grow, and I love teaching online, and I also love sharing articles where I get more detailed and sending emails to everybody. So I might want to talk about that, but I also have hobbies that I'm really interested in. I also have a deep interest in South America and travel and photography I might want to mention. So if you're outside the office, you can share, kind of tell me about yourself. And last week we talked about saying that, I'm a student right now, but I'm really passionate about working in architecture. I'm a student right now, but I really want to analyze different cultures, right? I don't know. I'm just coming up with ideas as on the fly as we speak. You can say, right now I'm studying to be a lawyer, but I volunteer at a food kitchen because I really want to help people who are less fortunate. Already, that's more information than lawyer. You're also sharing interesting person because you're sharing that you care about other people. And so you can give more information, right? You can say, right now, I'm taking care of my kids, but I'm really excited to, but in my free time, I really like to go skiing. I really like to go biking. I like to go for hikes, or I really like to create art, right? There's lots of things that you can say. So basically, as you answer this question, you want to keep in mind your goal and your intention and what do you want to happen after you speak with this person? Maybe the conversation keeps flowing, maybe you'll see them at another event, especially if they're an acquaintance or someone you see a lot and you want to learn more about them. So think about how you want them to remember you. And basically, the most important thing to understand about this question is it's basically a jumping off point, a starting point to help two people understand each other and let the conversation flow from there. So, whatever information you provide, it enables the other person to ask more specific questions going forward. It enables the person to really be able to continue the conversation. Like I said in episode 1, when you answer a question, give the person as much information as possible to enable them to ask you better questions. If somebody gives you information, you already are able to ask them better questions. So if you decide to ask, tell me about yourself, you can lead into more interesting questions later based on their response. So instead of you having to come up with a perfect answer to tell me about yourself, you can ask, hey, it's so nice to meet you. My name is Anna. Tell me about yourself. Like, what's your story? What brings you here? Right? And then the conversation can evolve from there. Instead of you having to think, how can I present myself perfectly? You can ask the other person. My caution is that in a job interview where they're interviewing you, you want them to ask the question. You shouldn't ask that. You can ask about other things. So I hope that helps you understand different ways to use this question to start a conversation, to continue a conversation. Give as much information as seems relevant and interesting to keep the conversation going. Well, that was it for me. I'm Kim from English with Kim. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend. And if you didn't have a chance to answer the questions and tell me about yourself and tell me about yourself, please leave a comment below and I will be sure to respond to you. I love getting to know you guys. This is episode 2 of Conversations with Kim. We will be meeting again next week for episode 3. If you would like email reminders of when we're going live so that you're not always on YouTube and so you don't miss a lesson, please click the link that will be below this video in order to sign up for email reminders. You'll also join my email community. And I'm looking forward to sharing more tips with you soon, making sure this is really useful and helps you have better conversations in English. So once again, this was Conversations with Kim. I'm Kim. I appreciate you guys. I'm so thankful for your participation. I love your questions and your energy, and I look forward to sharing more tips with you soon. Have a good one. Goodbye.